So Canada's Prime Minister just stood at a podium in Brussels, flanked by the leaders of the European Union, the United Kingdom, Japan, and Australia, and declared the American world order dead. Not dying, not struggling, dead. He said it calmly, without raising his voice, without a trace of anger. And the room packed with diplomats, heads of state, and journalists from 60 countries gave him a standing ovation. Trump's response was immediate, volcanic, and according to three people who were in the room at the White House, the angriest anyone has ever seen him in his political career. He threatened consequences so extreme that his own advisers tried to physically take the phone out of his hands. And then Warren Buffett did something he almost never does. He called a press conference, the first he's initiated in over a decade, and what he said about the future of American economic power made Wall Street go completely silent. When you hear what the Prime Minister actually said, the specific words he used, the alliances he announced, and the economic realignment he set in motion with a single speech, you'll understand why historians are already calling this the most significant address by a foreign leader about the United States, since Charles de Gaulle pulled France out of NATO's military command in 1966. Except this time, it's not just one country walking away. It's the beginning of an avalanche. Let me take you to Brussels. The venue was the European Council building, the same room where the most consequential decisions in European history have been made for the last 2 decades. The Prime Minister had requested a joint session broadcast live to the world. That request alone was unprecedented. Canadian Prime Ministers don't convene international summits. They attend them. The fact that this one called the meeting told every diplomat in the building that something extraordinary was about to happen. The stage was set with 7 flags: Canada, the European Union, the United Kingdom, Japan, Australia, South Korea, and New Zealand. 7 flags, representing nations whose combined GDP exceeds 28 trillion, roughly equivalent to the entire economic output of the United States. The Prime Minister approached the podium at 10:14 a.m. Central European Time. He wore a dark suit, no flag pin, no notes. He looked directly into the camera and began speaking. For 80 years, he said, the democratic world has operated under a single assumption that the United States of America would lead. That American power, American institutions, and American commitments would provide the foundation upon which the rest of us could build our economies, our security, and our democratic societies. That assumption held through the Cold War. It held through the fall of the Berlin Wall. It held through September 11th, through the financial crisis, and through a global pandemic. That assumption no longer holds. The silence in the room was the kind you feel in your chest. We cannot build our national security on a foundation that changes with every election cycle. We cannot build our economic prosperity on trade agreements that may be torn up within 4 years of being signed. We cannot build our democratic institutions on the assumption that our most powerful ally will remain committed to the values we share when the evidence of the last several years tells us otherwise. For years, we tried dialogue. We tried patience. We waited through the tariffs. We waited through the withdrawal from international agreements. We waited through the public questioning of alliances that generations of Americans and Canadians built together, sometimes with their blood. And at some point, waiting became its own form of irresponsibility. Because while we waited for Washington to return to reliability, our citizens were paying the price. Here's what makes this different from every other criticism of American leadership you've ever heard. This wasn't a speech designed to pressure the United States into changing. This wasn't a warning. This was a speech designed to announce that Canada and its allies had already stopped waiting. The decision had already been made. The agreements had already been negotiated, drafted, reviewed, and signed. The architecture of a new order had already been built quietly, methodically, over the previous 18 months. And this speech was simply the moment they told the world it existed. The Prime Minister then announced the formation of what he called the Democratic Prosperity Compact, a multilateral framework for economic cooperation between Canada, the European Union, the United Kingdom, Japan, Australia, South Korea, and New Zealand. The agreement covered trade harmonization, joint infrastructure investment, coordinated technology regulation, shared supply chain resilience planning, and critically provisions for settling international trade in non-dollar currencies. He was careful with his language. He said the framework was not built against the United States and that the door remains open for American participation. But every diplomat in the room understood what that meant. The door was open the way a church door is open after a funeral. Technically, you can walk in, but the service is already over. And then he delivered the line that went viral in 40 countries within the hour. He looked directly into the camera and said, "The era of assuming American leadership is permanent. That era is over. It ended not because of any enemy abroad, but because of choices made in Washington. We did not want this, but we will not pretend it isn't happening." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The European Commission President began applauding before the sentence was finished. The British Prime Minister joined. Then Japan's Prime Minister. Then the entire room. The American ambassador sat motionless. Everyone else stood. This wasn't a critique. It was a eulogy. And the world gave it a standing ovation. Trump saw the speech on television. And what happened next, behind closed doors in the White House, is something his own staff is calling the worst afternoon of his presidency. According to 4 administration officials, Trump was in the private dining room off the Oval Office when the speech aired on Fox News. He watched the first 10 minutes in silence, which for anyone who knows, Trump is extraordinary. By the time the Prime Minister announced the Democratic Prosperity Compact, Trump had begun pacing. By the time the standing ovation began, he was shouting. One official described the scene. He wasn't angry like someone who lost a negotiation. He was angry like someone who just found out the world moved on without him. Like someone told him he doesn't matter anymore. Within 90 minutes, Trump had fired off 11 social media posts in rapid succession, each one angrier than the last. He called the Canadian Prime Minister weak, pathetic, a globalist puppet, and a leader of a country that wouldn't exist for 5 minutes without American protection. He threatened to withdraw the United States from NATO entirely, the most consequential military alliance in human history, dissolved in a social media post. He threatened a complete trade embargo on Canada. He threatened to revoke Canada's access to 5A's intelligence sharing. And he threatened in language that made even his own staff uncomfortable to make Canada pay a price they cannot imagine. Republican senators began calling the chief of staff within the hour, not to express support, to express alarm. One senator said, "Someone needs to take his phone. He's making us look insane." Each threat was louder than the last, each one more extreme, and each one more completely irrelevant, because every single threat he made had already been anticipated. Every card he played had already been countered. The Democratic Prosperity Compact had been designed to function without American participation. That wasn't a bug. It was the entire point. The NATO threat was meaningless because the European members had already begun building independent defence capabilities. The EU Rapid Deployment Force, a European defence fund with over €0.08 billion in capitalisation. The trade embargo threat was hollow because Canada had spent 18 months diversifying its trade partnerships across 3 continents. the same strategy that had already neutralized earlier tariff threats, and the intelligence sharing threat actually backfired. Within hours, the UK's government communications headquarters issued a quiet statement reaffirming its bilateral intelligence relationship with Canada independent of any American decision. Australia did the phone and did something he hasn't done since the 2008 financial crisis. He called a press conference. Warren Buffett does not call press conferences. He issues annual letters. He speaks at shareholders' meetings. He does not summon the financial press. That he felt this moment warranted the same treatment as the 2008 collapse tells you everything about the gravity of what just happened. Buffett stood at a podium in Omaha. No notes, no teleprompter, and SP.
Okay, for 11 minutes, what we witnessed.
Today wasn't a speech, Buffett said. It was an obituary, and I'm afraid it was accurate. The United States used to lead the global economy for a very simple reason. Not because we had the biggest military, not because we had the most nuclear weapons. We led because we were the most predictable, the most stable, and the most trustworthy partner in the room. That's how you attract capital. That's how you attract allies. That's how you build an order that lasts for 80 years. What we've seen in the last several years has systematically destroyed the one thing that made American leadership possible. Not our wealth, not our military, not our technology, our trustworthiness. When foreign central banks hold US Treasury bonds, they're not making a financial bet. They're making a trust bet. They're saying, we believe the United States will honor its obligations. That trust took generations to build. 70 years of consistent behavior, and I'm telling you today, it has been demolished. Not weakened, not cracked, demolished. Buffett then revealed that Berkshire Hathaway had been quietly increasing its international exposure for 18 months. Not because we're bearish on American workers. American workers are the finest. Not because we're bearish on American innovation. American innovation is extraordinary. We're bearish on American policy leadership. He closed with a line that financial commentators are calling the most significant statement Buffett has made since 2008. Empires don't collapse because of their enemies. They collapse because they stop being worth following. Today, the world told us it's found somewhere else to go. The question is whether we have the humility to understand why. Here's the thing. The Prime Minister's declaration didn't come out of nowhere. It was the final act in a pattern that's been building for years. A pattern of alliance destruction so consistent that historians will wonder how anyone was surprised. It started with NATO. The questioning of Article 5, the mutual defense clause that is the beating heart of the Western alliance, repeatedly publicly casting doubt on whether America would honor its most sacred commitment. The physical shoving of the Prime Minister of Montenegro at a NATO summit, literally pushing an allied leader out of the way. European diplomats still reference that moment as when they realized something fundamental had changed. Then came the trade agreements, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, painstakingly negotiated over 8 years, withdrawn from in 3 days, handing Pacific trade leadership to Beijing. The Paris Climate Accord, signed by 195 nations, withdrawn from handing global climate leadership to Europe. The Iran nuclear deal, negotiated alongside America's closest allies, torn up with no consultation. Each withdrawal sent the same unmistakable message. The United States will not honor its commitments. The signature of an American president means nothing, and the allies who tried to warn us were dismissed. Macron called NATO brain-dead, dismissed as French, grandstanding. Now it looks prophetic. Merkel said, "The times when we could fully rely on the United States are over." Treated as emotional. Now it reads like understatement. Every ally who sounded the alarm was dismissed as ungrateful. They weren't ungrateful. They were preparing. They were building the lifeboats while America insisted the ship wasn't sinking. So when Canada's Prime Minister stood at that podium and declared the American order dead, he wasn't making a prediction. He was stating a fact that every other leader already knew. The only people who didn't seem to know were in Washington. Here's what makes this different from every other period of American unpopularity: when the world disliked American policy during Vietnam, when millions protested the invasion of Iraq, when the 2008 crisis shattered confidence. During all of those moments, America's allies stayed. They stayed because even at its worst, American leadership was still preferable to the alternative. There was always a belief that America would course correct, that the next election would bring the country back to its senses. That belief is gone. That's what the Prime Minister's speech was really about. Not any single policy, not any single president. The death of the belief that America will course correct. The democratic world looked at the pattern and concluded, this is not temporary. This is the new normal, and you cannot build your future on a partner whose behavior you can no longer trust. This time, they're not waiting. They're leaving. And they've already built something to replace what they left behind. The Democratic Prosperity Compact isn't a protest. It's a functioning multilateral framework with signed agreements already being implemented. The combined GDP of its member nations exceeds $28 trillion, roughly equivalent to the entire United States. They didn't build an alternative. They built the successor. And here's what should keep every American awake at night. Buried in the technical annexes are provisions for settling international trade in non-dollar currencies. Euro-denominated energy contracts between the EU and Canada. Yen-denominated technology agreements between Japan and Australia, a multilateral clearing mechanism that allows member nations to trade without routing through the American financial system. The US dollar has been the world's reserve currency since 1944. That means most international trade is conducted in dollars. That creates enormous demand for the dollar, which allows the US to borrow at lower interest rates than any other country. It's the reason mortgage rates are lower. It's the reason the government can run deficits without triggering a debt crisis. Economists call it the exorbitant privilege. And it depends entirely on one thing: the world's willingness to hold dollars because they trust the country that prints them. This is the first serious institutional challenge to that trust since 1944. If global trade moves away from the dollar, even gradually, the consequences are concrete. Higher interest rates on mortgages and car loans, reduced foreign demand for treasury bonds, inflationary pressure as dollars held overseas flow back into the domestic economy. The dollar's dominance wasn't guaranteed by geography or constitution. It was guaranteed by trust. And trust is exactly what died on that stage in Brussels. The cruelest irony is the one Beijing understood immediately. China welcomed the speech. A world moving away from American leadership is a world where Chinese influence expands. But here's the twist. The Democratic Prosperity Compact was also designed to contain China. It creates a democratic economic bloc powerful enough to set global standards without American chaos or Chinese domination. It's a third way, and it exists entirely because the last several years made it necessary. The nations that signed it would have preferred the old system. But when that system became unreliable, they adapted. They built something new. And in doing so, they created the very thing that could have been America's greatest strategic asset, a democratic counterweight to authoritarian China. Except America isn't in it. Because America is the reason it was needed. They built a new order, not against America, but because of America. That distinction is the most devastating sentence in modern geopolitics. So here's where we are. Canada's Prime Minister stood in Brussels and declared the American order dead. The democratic world gave him a standing ovation. Trump responded with the most furious outburst of his presidency. Every threat bounced off a world that had already moved on. Buffett called a press conference and delivered an obituary for American global leadership. America's closest allies announced a new framework with combined GDP rivaling the US, complete with provisions to move trade away from the dollar. And the world applauded with the quiet relief of people who had finally stopped pretending. This isn't about one speech or one president. This is about whether the most powerful country in history just lost its place at the head of the table. Not because someone took it, because it walked away. The chair isn't empty. Someone else is already sitting in it. Can the United States rejoin an order it no longer leads? Will the dollar survive if the nations that hold it no longer trust the nation that prints it? Was this the moment the American century ended, or just the moment the world finally said it out loud? The speech has been given. The alliances have been signed. The money has moved. What happens next is up to a country that for the first time in 80 years has to earn its place at the table instead of assuming it.